Hi, class. This is Module 8, Objectives 3 and 4. Without further ado, objective number 3, we're going to compare and contrast those two additional family treatment model, the family systems model and the behavioral models. And so then we're going to get into an objective 4, and we'll get into some of the specific treatments in terms of therapies using these family systems models. And the therapies will mainly be based on these two models. Again, we don't really use that disease model and all that codependency stuff that we talked about in the last one anymore. Okay, first let's talk about the family systems model. The family systems model contends that the family system is more than a sum of its parts. You can't just look at, individuals. And so normally when we would talk about in this class the treatment of substance use disorders, we're talking about, looking into that individual. For example, some of the more traditional models, the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic model, those would be like, well, what are the individuals' other issues in terms of anxiety, depression, everything. But this just doesn't say, let's look at the individual solely. In fact, it concentrates on the entire family. And it looks at communication patterns among family members. It looks at some of those multi-generational effects. Because as you remember, these effects go down generationally, and so it could be happen from an earlier generation. It looks at things like boundaries, which we're going to talk about, and rules in a family. And a lot of times these are implicit kinds of rules and boundaries, things that we don't really know about or we don't really discuss, but we adhere to them. So first, let's look at boundaries. There's a boundaries continuum. And so you might think about the boundaries that you have in your family. There's a quite rigid boundaries. And the dark lines here around the rigid boundaries refer to real intense separation. So these are different people in the family and different roles in the family. And in the very rigid one, it's very restrictive. Everybody sort of kind of is in their place. And there's often some unspoken rules or messages, and we'll talk about some of these when we talk about the rules on the next slide. But one common one that's talked about is don't talk, don't feel, don't trust within that family. And that tends to lead to a lot of separation between individuals, where there's a lot of isolation. People remain on their own. They're very independent. And there's also stagnation that results from that, because you don't get this kind of growth of the family connections. Then there's the clear and healthy boundaries. And again, these are not quite so rigid. They're a little bit closer together. We see now the lines are not so dark there. There's a genuine connection between people in the family. They're not trying to control or coerce one another. There's some flexibility in how people relate to each other. There's very clear communication between people in the family, and there's a healthy kind of separateness where people can function independently but still maintain those connections in the family. And then finally, there's the diffuse boundaries, and that's where there's quite a bit of overlap in boundaries between the roles of family members. It's very permissive. The roles are very unclear. So, for example, I might sometimes, though I'm a child in my family, I might have to serve as a parent. And the parent might act like a child. There's kind of an over-involvement with each other, feeling smothered by the other person. And this may cause use among children or caretaking as a duty, where your child feels like they've got to do caretaking. It may also result in substance use among children when they have a substance using parent. So I want you to think about your own family. Do you have rigid boundaries? Are you really, really separate? Do you have clear and healthy where you're kind of interconnected? You've got a connection, but you also are pretty, you've got your own independent thing going on. You support each other, you don't coerce each other. Or do you have diffuse boundaries where it feels like you're really kind of smothering each other and your roles are all overlapping? So that's something that family systems will look at. The family systems models will also examine or concentrate on the concept of family rules. And in families, what happens is, again, they're moving toward this equilibrium. They're always wanting this sort of stability, this predictability, this homeostasis. And so rules form to create that equilibrium, and so that conflict doesn't erupt, so that we don't get this sort of imbalance going on. And so so it may be, for example, here's a rule in a family that is facing addiction, that anger is sort of allowed to be expressed when the person is drinking. So if the person is drunk, well, then they're allowed to sort of scream and yell. What happens in a lot of families is that drinking or drug use is actually associated not with anger, but with affection. And so, for example, when people are drinking, they may be more likely to hug and tell each other how much they love each other. What about this one? Don't talk about the person's substance use. And again, this is sort of an unwritten rule. So don't go, children don't go learn quite quickly. Don't go to school and talk about how mom and dad are smoking weed at home and things like that. So we don't do that inside the family or outside the family. We don't confront each other on our substance use and things like that. So we get this kind of, I'd say, this graphic here says rules of dysfunctional families, but actually these rules make the family functional in the sense that they kind of keep the family together and functioning in a stable way. So again, they create this equilibrium. That said, it might actually support the problem behavior, like addiction. Okay, I want to move now into the behavioral models. The behavioral models are based on operant conditioning, which we've talked about before on an individual basis. So let's go back to operant conditioning. A behavior that gets rewarded tends to increase. Okay, so the consequence of the behavior matters. And the idea here is that the rewards are not at the individual level. So we talked about before, like, oh, if I smoke weed, then I get high and I feel good. That's a reward, okay? But this is a reward at the family level. So, for example, the drug use may cause homeostasis, may cause lack of conflict, because everybody knows when a person's using, you kind of leave them alone, you don't expect much, right? And it may actually help you to stay together because, again, affection might be produced and stuff like that. So let me just go through some of the kind of examples I got here. If a person is using drugs and that creates the ability to be affectionate with a family member, that may be a reward. Maybe that a family member helps clean up during a partner's hangover or does some caretaking when the partner has a hangover or has a crash following use of another drug. What about when the grandparents are willing to take the children when mom and dad are partying or using drugs or alcohol? Then the grandparents have kind of rewarded in some ways the use of drugs or alcohol. There are certain family behaviors that are associated reliably with lots of research support with less substance use. And I wanted to bring up a couple of those. One is family rituals. So I want you to think about the rituals that you have in your family. It may be like, oh, well, we take a summer vacation together, or we always eat dinner together, or we always check in with each other in the morning. We always say good night to each other at night. These kinds of family rituals tend to be associated with less substance use in the family. And another thing that that another behavior that's associated with less substance use in the family is parental monitoring of children. And now, usually with little kids, they get monitored quite a bit. But during adolescence, we start to see monitoring in a lot of families drop off. So, are parents keeping up with what their children are doing? Now, in both of these cases, family rituals and parental monitoring, I want you to remember that poverty affects these quite a bit. So, for example, in a family that's facing poverty, it just may not be possible to eat together every night because, family members are having to work at these times and that times and everything gets discombobulated. It may not be possible to take a family vacation because you don't have the money or you don't have the time or you have to work. Parental monitoring may be very difficult for a parent who's working 2 jobs and is struggling to make ends meet. So poverty really minimizes those. And that's one of the ways in which poverty becomes associated with substance use disorders. There's lots and lots of research support for these behavioral models, and I want you to kind of come back to that that first chapter on learning theory, where we talked about there's lots of research support for the idea that the rewarding aspects of drug use seem to promote drug use. Right. And so these are just sort of expanding to like, where are the family rewards for drug use? Okay. If you're if you're using a behavioral model, one of the things that people do is what's called a functional analysis. And the idea behind a functional analysis is this sort of what happens when idea. And it's to understand how all these systems and all these family members contribute to and maintain the addictive behavior. So what happens when a kid misses school? How do family members react? What happens when then the school counselor calls to say that the kid misses school? How do family members react? What's the aftermath, right? What happens when a child gets caught, let's say, smoking in school or using a vape in school or something like that? Again, what's the consequence with regard to the family, or the kid doesn't come home at night? And so the kind of functional analysis here is a little bit broader there in the graphic there, but it'll give you some of the idea. It's kind of what comes before, what comes after, what's the situation like, and specifically when we're talking about behavioral models of family systems, we're looking at what happens with the family. Okay. Another thing that behavioral models do is they do a kind of coping analysis. And so the family is coping with the drug use or alcohol use in one member of the family. And this is kind of the family's best effort to resolve the addiction in the most rewarding and least distressing ways. So these are ways that families sort of hit on typically to be able to kind of get back to that homeostasis where the family wants to be. So one of the ways they do it is to put up with it. And that's, tolerating drug use, basically accepting like, oh, this person's going to use drugs, sometimes sacrificing, like, well, I needed help with my homework tonight, but mom is using, and so she's not going to be helpful. Also, I'm doing other things like making sure the door is locked at night because I don't think she's going to remember that she should do that. I'm going to, help her get up to brush her teeth because she's passed out on the couch, whatever. Okay, another possible ways that family copes with it is to stand up to it. And that is confronting the addiction, resisting, trying to change that behavior in the family member. And then finally, another way is to withdraw from it. And that's avoiding that family member, escaping, getting out of the house, becoming independent as soon as possible, getting away from the family. Well, what happens is that sometimes these kind of family efforts to cope end up perpetuating the problem. So I think we've talked about that in the putting up with it, you know what I mean, in the sense that if you're sacrificing and you're cleaning up after this person and you're driving them around and you're doing this and that to try to kind of cope with this addiction, you may actually be supporting the addiction. Withdrawing from it can also support the addiction. So if you say, well, I'm not going to be around him if he's drinking or something like that, that may sort of allow him or give him that space to be able to carry out the addiction. So sometimes these efforts to cope end up being sort of part of the problem. And so this analysis of coping is important to see where these coping efforts are helping and where they're not helping. Okay, I want to talk about some different evidence-based approaches. And I'm going to talk about three. I'm going to talk about CRAFT, which is one evidence-based approach, behavioral couples therapy, and then I'm going to talk about 4 different therapies for adolescent substance use. Okay, let's start with CRAFT. First off, I want to say family-based approaches tend to be very effective. So these are extremely effective approaches for addiction. They have better outcomes. They tend to have better outcomes when you're treating the whole family. They have better outcomes compared to individual therapy when you're just treating the person who is addicted, or group therapy or psychoeducation. We tend to do better with family systems therapies. And it's usually a blend of 2 or 3 family models. And there's where we're really not using that disease model, right, much anymore. We're using the family systems model and the behavioral model, and usually it's a blend of the 2. And I think you'll see that when we get into some of these specific therapies. Not everyone benefits from these approaches. Some people are going to do better with an individualized approach, but on the whole, they tend to do better than many other approaches. Okay, so what are the goals of these family-based interventions? You want to basically engage the entire family in a plan for system-wide change. They've usually reached this homeostasis that involves the addiction, right? Where the addiction is now the fulcrum of this mobile, and it's sort of, there's a homeostasis there, but unfortunately it supports these problem behaviors. So we've got to kind of shake it up. We got to do this system-wide change, make things different. They tend to clarify and reinforce family roles. For example, parental discipline of children. That's a family role. A lot of times when a parent is addicted, the children will sort of become parental in some ways, taking care of the parent. These therapies are generally abstinence-based therapies. They're all about achieving and maintaining abstinence in the family, and then improving these relationship dynamics so that the family relationships are supporting healthy behaviors rather than supporting unhealthy behaviors. Okay, so the first one is called community reinforcement and family training, or it's for short, we call it CRAFT. And this is a unique in the sense that it treats the family when the person who is addicted doesn't want help. So the person who's addicted is refusing help. They're saying, I don't want help. I don't want to go to therapy, blah, blah, blah. Then the family anyway does a therapy. What they do is they run a functional analysis. They look at how, when this problem behavior happens, where are families involved? How are family members connected to the problem behavior? How do family members operate when this problem behavior starts? How do they operate after the problem behavior? And they're going to focus on functional behavioral skills. So things like influencing that user, the person who is addicted, to get help. I mean, one of the big things is trying to get that family member into treatment, right? They're also going to do some reinforcement training, ways to reinforce healthy behaviors rather than reinforcing the unhealthy or the behaviors of using. They're going to use positive communication styles, because a lot of times we think of family interventions just like this sort of intervention TV show where families get in there and they say, you're messing up our whole family. we hate you, you are, hurting everybody, blah, 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 or we love you, but you're destroying all of us. And it's a real confrontational and very negative style. These are positive communication styles that they're teaching here. They're teaching families to say, what is it that I want from you, rather than what you shouldn't be doing. Okay, so it's asking them to just state things in very positive ways. And another really important aspect of craft is that they teach self-care for family members. So family members are a lot of times suffering. They're self-sacrificing to support this addiction. So how do you take care of yourself when your family member is addicted? These are effective. Craft is an effective treatment. It is flexible. It is cost effective. Depending on the study, about 55% to 86% of users seek treatment after craft. So all they've treated was a family member. And this is the number of users who will seek treatment. So the family member is influential. The family members are influential in getting the person who's addicted to seek treatment, which is awesome. It's about 3 times more effective than Al-Anon, which you remember is the AA version for families. It's about 2 times more effective than confrontational therapies, where the family goes in and does an intervention and confronts the person and, does this whole kind of aggressive intervention technique like the TV show. Okay, next therapy, behavioral couples therapy. Well, as in the name, this is for couples. And it's about 12 to 26 sessions. It's going to focus on eliminating substance use in the person who is using. It engages that kind of family support, the support of the significant other for change. You're trying to, again, change these relationship dynamics and change these interactions. So you're focusing on the interactions surrounding that use, right? It can include a lot of times between the couple, daily sobriety contracts, where you actually have a contract, a written contract that is like, okay, today, this is what's going to go down. Conflict regulation, so to make sure that conflicts are not getting heated or that are going well. Communication skills, homework, and a lot of times the homework is like affection, doing affection during non-using time. So again, affection as reinforcement, but not affection when the person is using, because you don't want to reinforce the drug use. A lot of times with behavioral couples therapy, they'll do plans for post-treatment and steps to take when in recovery after the person has stopped using. So one question is, does behavioral couples therapy work? It is one of the most effective treatments for alcohol use. So, as opposed to treating the whole family, you're just treating the couple there, and yet it's still really, really effective. So the significant other has a major influence here. It reduces substance use, improves relationships. It's better. It comes out as, when tested against individual and group treatments, it comes out as better than many, many ones. Though one issue is in how long-lived that treatment lasts. So you've really got to get people to continue to use the techniques that they're taught, because a lot of times they'll revert back. So that's one issue with this treatment. Okay, I want to talk about 4 in particular, family-based approaches for adolescent substance use. So this is when adolescent children are using, as opposed to, say, another family member. I'm going to talk about brief strategic family therapy, functional family therapy, multidimensional family therapy, and multisystemic family therapy, and we'll contrast those in the next slide. Multisystemic family therapy, I'll say right now, is the most extensive and rigorous research base of all of those, because it's been around for quite a long time, but all of them have a great large research base. They are all very effective. They're effective when compared to treatment as usual or other treatments that they've been tested against. So all of these are very, very effective, and they've been used for quite some time. Okay, so let's first look at brief strategic family therapy. This is a strategic therapy that really focuses on the substance use, and it tries to be brief, right? So we're trying to do it in as few sessions as possible. So it's very problem focused. You go in there and you look very carefully at what goes on surrounding that substance use. It's going to focus on inappropriate family alliances, which sometimes is sort of like a triangulation where two people will gang up on another person. Boundaries, which we spoke about already, the rigid versus diffuse boundaries versus healthy boundaries. It's usually 8 to 24 sessions, so a lot can be accomplished in those 8 sessions. It's usually done in a clinical setting. They've got some specific techniques. One is just restructuring those interaction patterns. So finding out what are the problematic patterns that may be supporting the substance use and then restructuring those. They do some other interesting things. One is joining. And that's when the therapist, quote unquote, joins the family or acts like a sort of family leader, as if they are sort of a major figure in the family during this therapy. Enactment is having the family speak as if the therapist is not there, but the therapist is there and observes what's going on in the family dynamics. And finally, they do quite a bit of tracking, monitoring family members and monitoring use. And that's going to be common in many of these therapies. Okay, let's go to functional family therapy. This is focusing on the functions that regulate the relationships. So, for example, these are kind of things like coping, distancing from a family member. What does that do? How does that regulate the relationship? How does that affect use? How do these interactions result in interpersonal payoffs? So when I distance myself from my drug using husband, let's say, or partner, then how does that result in an interpersonal payoff for me or for him, right? So that may be, that there may be some payoffs in the sense that I'm protected from dealing with the substance use, and he's protected from me being upset about the substance use. This will be 12 sessions over 3 to 6 months, and so it's also fairly brief. It can take place in a clinical or home setting. It'll involve generally an assessment to try to figure out what's going on, some therapy, and then a lot of psychoeducational stuff to try to, get people up on what these payoffs are and how these payoffs or these rewards or reinforcements or whatever you want to call them will support that substance use and how we can change things to not support them. Multidimensional family therapy comes out of family and developmental psychology, is a major influence. And, again, it's going to look at what reinforcement maintains behaviors, what reinforcements are taking place in that family that are maintaining those behaviors. It's family-based outpatient therapy. So the family comes in, it's pretty intensive in the sense that it's a couple of sessions per week, and it usually takes place over 3 months. And it really focuses on the parent-teen relationship because, again, remember the users in all of these cases are adolescents. So the person with the substance use problem is an adolescent. It'll look at psychosocial ecologies of use, meaning community. How is the community affecting the use or supporting the use or reacting to the use in ways that support the use? How is the school doing so? Because, for example, the school may even support the use through what do you call it when they kick someone out of school for a brief period of time? I can't remember what it's called. Or put someone in detention or whatever. Sometimes those kinds of punishments, suspension, that's what I'm going for, can actually be reinforcing, right? Because it takes the kid out of class and things like that. So multi-systemic family therapy comes from social ecology theory, which is a theory that was put forth by Brofenbrenner, and you may be familiar with that from another class, but it really looks at school, community, and broader, even society, and broader areas of influence. The idea is to restructure the environment, again, just like they all do. They're going to restructure those kind of interactions in the family, but also outside of the family. It's a very intensive team-based approach, and that makes it different from the other approaches. So you're going to have a whole team working with the family. They work with the family in over about 3 to 4 months. It's going to take place in the natural environment. So it's going to take place in the school, in the home, in the community centers and things like that. It's going to teach the caregivers skills. So for example, discipline of children, monitoring of children. And it's very much into a very continuous tracking, like doing urine analysis at home all the time to make sure when the kids are using and not using. So those are our therapies. I wanted to just get some main research takeaways here. There's lots of evidence for behavioral family therapies. And so what we tend to get in the current world of family systems therapies is a blend of this behavioral, looking at the reinforcements, and family systems approaches, looking at rules, looking at boundaries. And those seem to be, this blend seems to be a really effective way of treating addiction. Reciprocal causality makes these unique, makes these approaches unique. And reciprocal causality is this idea that every family member affects every other family member. So if you are using drugs in your family, you are affecting all of your family members, but they are also affecting you. And they may be, in fact, supporting your use in some ways or another. Okay, so here's some take-home points. There are three main models: the family disease model, which we don't use much anymore, family systems, and behavioral models, which are often combined for most of the therapies. There is the most empirical support by far for the family systems and behavioral models. There are effective family and couple-based and system-based therapies. So these are very, very effective. So I want to just emphasize some of the most effective things that we've got out there for addiction, and they're widely used as well. So you see them, you see family systems therapy in a lot of addiction treatments. The functionality of substance use, interpersonal relationships, and the greater ecological context, the school, the community, the juvenile justice system, are going to play a role in these approaches. Though mostly they're focused on the family, they're also looking at some of these broader ones, especially some of the last two approaches that we talked about. So I hope you guys have a great day and that you enjoyed Module 6.